Welcome to ISO 20022 Made Simple, a special podcast series brought to you by Standard Chartered's Corporate and Investment Bank. I'm Danielle Sharp, our Global Head of FI Clearing Product in Cash Management.
This is our fourth episode in the series. Over the first three episodes, we have discussed opportunities in compliance, explored how data and AI could enable banks over time, and most recently, we spent some time with Swift on the practicalities of CBPR Plus implementation as we get closer to November 2025. In today's episode, I'm excited to be joined by two fantastic guests who will spend some time talking with me about their experiences in Europe and Asia. We'll explore the regional journeys of ISO 20022 and potentially how lessons from both sides of the world could shape the future language of payments. So with that, let me introduce you to our guests. Firstly, we're joined by Joanne Fraser. Jo is Standard Chartered's very own Head of Transaction Banking for the UK, as well as the Head of Cash Product for the UK and Europe. Thank you for joining us, Jo.
Thanks, Danielle.
And secondly, a very special guest, Camilla Bullock. Camilla is the CEO of Emerging Payments Association Asia, which is a leading industry association bringing together banks, fintechs, payment providers, regulators alike, driving policy advocacy, fostering collaboration, and serving as a regional voice in APAC's evolving payments landscape. Okay, let's jump in. Jo, I'm going to start with you, and please feel free to provide a bit of an introduction to yourself and your experience before you respond to the question. But my question is really to pivot and start with Europe. It's only right, given SEPA was one of the very first major implementations of ISO 20022 domestically, and certainly comes with early adopter status. And we know that ISO really isn't very new to Europe. And as such, SEPA is often hailed as a benchmark for regional integration and structured data in payments. And so with that in mind, and shifting to today and CBPR Plus, how do you think that experience might have helped?
Thanks, Danielle. And by way of introduction, so as you mentioned, I lead our UK business as well as our cash product business across UK and Europe. And I have been in the industry and in these markets now for well over a decade. So I'm familiar with the original rollout of SEPA to the XML standard. And I think there are actually a lot of learnings from that time. If I think about, part of the intent back when SEPA moved to the new standard, it was a number of countries across the eurozone coming together to harmonise their payment infrastructure and to move to a common standard. So Europe is made up of a number of countries who all had their own local national payments system. And this was about bringing them all together into a harmonised standard. So very much what we are trying to achieve now as we move to ISO 20022. It seems almost a bit bizarre that we're talking about it. It feels like maybe 15 years later. It's so long ago. But if I remember at the time, the intent was very clear. And yes, there was a view that we would get a number of benefits around data and we would get that harmonisation. But I think there's definitely some learnings from that time. One, originally around, I guess, the deadline moved. And with that, it was very difficult working with clients to get them to move to the new standard. As soon as a deadline moves once, people think it's going to move again. And I know we've heard that also on CBPR Plus. No, the deadline in November is not moving. It is a hard fixed date. Unless somebody knows something I don't know. But it did move originally, and actually clients really struggled to get to that deadline. It meant a lot of change for them in their systems, not something that could just be done by flicking a switch in the 6-month period. So I think the key learning for us, and particularly as we move to getting our corporates moving onto the ISO standard post-November, client engagement is really crucial, understanding the time frame that it takes for them to change their systems and working with them around specifications and testing with them to make sure that it really works end to end for them. The second thing was around going native in the system. So I know many banks this time round have been using converters, and a small number will still continue to use converters after November. But there comes a point where you really need to go to that end-to-end native compliance, because it causes problems around data truncation, it causes problems around end-to-end compliance, and it causes problems around data quality. And if we really want to realise the benefits of moving to the ISO standard, we need to make sure that our systems are truly passing through everything end-to-end. So I think that was one of the challenges also on SEPA at the time. Personally, I'm not sure we've really seen the benefits around data from SEPA, but is it still early days? Perhaps not. Perhaps as we move globally to this kind of standard, we will all get our heads around it. There's new technology now. Data is far more integral into how we run our businesses, and therefore now is perhaps the time to realise that benefit.
Really good points, and I'm going to come to Camilla very shortly, because I think this is a really interesting point around the journey that Europe had to go on to really bring a number of national payment systems to a harmonized point, and Asia is a lot further away from that. But before I go to Camilla, and I will come back on some of the points you mentioned here, Jo, because I think they're incredibly crucial. I do want to just touch on the regulatory side of Europe as well. So we know that Europe has no shortage of regulatory ambition. And in the context of payments and the ongoing developments in Europe, I am quite interested in your experience on how modernization and regulation come together in our role as a banking provider. And particularly given the topic of today's episode, the friction points where, ISO and foundational formats, perhaps data converters, the journey that Europe's been on, and how those two have gone hand in hand.
Yeah, I think there's maybe a couple of points I want to bring out. One is on, I guess on SEPA, the desire to get to a harmonized state, it took a bit of time. So there was still local interpretation. And I think we still see that now, and we'll see more of it, in the lead up to November, as we see more payments coming through MX. And I think post-November, this is something all the banks are going to have to work together on how do we get to the new norm on the new standard, because it took some time on SEPA. But also, if I look at the domestic systems also for high value, so Target 2 and the UK RTGS systems, they have also been moving towards the ISO standard, yet that harmonization hasn't been completely synced. So yes, there's been a regulatory deadline to move to these new states, but they've not been completely harmonized time-wise, which means that there is a difference in how they're being implemented and what's mandatory, what's not mandatory. And at the end of the day, it's just been about getting to the regulatory deadline and getting it implemented. I'm sure we will all feel the benefit of that, but in the period of transition and kind of coexistence between all of them, it is, I think, for the banks quite challenging.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I guess sticking with this theme then for a moment. So naturally, we're running on a compliance journey, particularly where there's regulatory deadlines that are enforcing the need for, certain PMIs to go live on certain deadlines. And of course, CBPR Plus is on a similar journey. And you spoke earlier about some of the learnings that were taken back in the SEPA period, where deadlines had moved, clients were struggling. There was a huge amount of change. And I think that level of change is no different with CBPR Plus. So given the experience that Europe has had as a region, having done this through the SEPA journey, do you think that this time round with CBPR Plus, it's helped drive less of a compliance attitude and maybe more of a commercial view?
In all honesty, no. I think the regulatory burden, and it might not just be here in Europe, I do think it is the same in other jurisdictions, albeit I do think that Asia has more of an attitude towards innovation. Yeah. I think we are all running to get to a date, and we're doing everything within our power to get there. And once we're there, I think we'll get to the next phase of what can we really leverage to get the benefits of taking all of this pain, all of this investment, making all of this change, modernizing all of our systems? How do we really realize the benefit of it? But I think at the moment, everybody's focused on the date.
Yeah, I would tend to
there's other
agree.
regulations around that everybody's also trying to do at the same time. So, sadly, I think that is the reality of it. And it's something that is recognised also by the regulators. It's recognised in the UK with the work that's been done around the national payments vision. And how do we try, in time to take away some of that regulatory burden so that people see it as an opportunity to innovate, because it's recognised that there is a bit of a regulatory deadlock that everybody is just running towards.
Yeah, and actually, I've got an extra question that I'm going to ask you at this point, which, given that you sit on a number of industry bodies, you sit across the UK, you sit across Europe, and you engage with a number of banks and regulators on a very regular basis, how are you seeing that conversation progress, perhaps 12 months ago to now? Yeah, talk me through what you're seeing in terms of that progress.
Yeah, so in the UK specifically, I sit on the SWIFT UK board, and with a number of the member banks, ISO is a regular topic on the agenda, and the progress that we're making, some of the best practices that we have in getting to the date and driving adoption. Nobody around the table says we're not going to get there. But interestingly, everybody says they are running to get there.
Yeah.
And whenever we talk about some of the other innovations that we would like to explore, that we might like to do proof of concepts around, everybody says we just need to get through this kind of regulatory period. So I think everybody feels constrained from a time, investment, effort, bandwidth perspective. And everybody is really focused on ensuring regulatory compliance, which is good in one sense, but something needs to change, I think, and hopefully it will once this big change. This is a massive transition that the globe is facing that we probably haven't ever really had simultaneously. I think once we get through this phase, hopefully things start to unlock and we can start to think a bit more innovatively.
Excellent. Thank you, Jo. Camilla, I'm going to switch over to you for the next section. Now, I think we've had some incredibly interesting learnings, insights, but also advantages in many ways that Europe has managed to gain, certainly through its regional harmonization journey that has had to occur over the years, or certainly over the last decade. And Jo touched on it. I think Asia has a very different regional flavor altogether, and is a region that I would agree has probably carved a path that's rooted in speed and innovation. So with that in mind, how would you characterize the pace and the posture of adoption of ISO 20022 across the region? And again, before you respond, please, of course, do feel free to add some context to you and the role that you play.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me as a guest. So I actually done migration to ISO 20022 since 2009, because I used to work in data and did the capital markets corporate action migration back then already. So always been focused and have a big understanding for how valuable clean structured data is and what that can mean to unlock values. And in my role now as leading the Emerging Payments Association Asia, data is at the heart of everything we do. I often say, if you break down payments, it is the movement of data. But coming in, yes, as both of you and Joanne is saying, APAC is arguably the most exciting and innovative payments region we have. And when other people talking about digital first as a trend, that's really where we started. It's the foundation for payments in many of our markets, looking at countries like India, Indonesia, Thailand, where people really skipped that card era that we had in the US and Europe and went straight into QR payments and wallets. And that is the way that they're interacting with financial services. And those services that built for example, UPI in India or PromptPay in Thailand, those real-time payment stack was built with ISO 20022 in mind, and they were built with digital first and also to be inclusive. So there was some lead in that way, and seeing how different services came to market. But if we put in ISO 20022 in this really fragmented region with so many different solutions, I think that it's been seen not just as a technical standard, it's also becoming a universal translator. And this is how the wallets and different payments option actually can connect into the domestic infrastructure. But maybe even more exciting, and what we're talking here today, is those linkages around QR payments that we've seen in our region and really have set pace for innovation. First one being between Singapore and Thailand in 2021, and two very different tech stacks. But the common language data layers that they found was then created around ISO 20022. So it's really been an enabler. But it's not just easy, absolutely not just easy. Some of those solutions we've seen has not at all been created with any banking standards in mind. So we see a lot of what Joanne was referring to. We need to have translators and more integration efforts are being used to bridge those gaps. If I just touching a little bit on the banking side, on what we're seeing also, like the leading pockets we will see around real-time payments, that there's also being a lot of banks, specifically domestic or mid-tier banks, that have very like all the legacy system, where it's not about migrating into a new data standard. It's actually revamping everything. It's cost, it's time. And something that's come up in several discussions is that we are a region in Southeast Asia that still likes solving things with people also. So like it's still cost beneficial to have a few more people, and also so it just sounds a little bit different there. So we see a little bit of lag in those pockets. So different between, you can't really compare like a market like Cambodia, for example, with Hong Kong or things like that.
Yeah, so, and I guess on that topic, you've spoken to some of the nuances and the fact that Asia is just a drastic and vast region, and there are so many individual differences with the countries within that. So based on the conversations you're having, are you seeing pockets of acceleration, perhaps maybe tied to the markets that are truly moving ahead with QR codes or with instant payment linkages? And compare that with markets that are perhaps a little bit further behind in terms of innovation generally. And are you seeing them tackle or having to manage some levels of friction that perhaps they just weren't having to face before?
Yes, absolutely, because we see some of the domestic system also using their own, like for example in Japan, it's not using Latin characters. The domestic system have one language, and the international cross-border system has another language, and you say same challenge in Philippines. So that is just a complete different set of challenges that those markets are up against.
Yeah, obviously having presence in Japan as well as Standard Chartered, we know that there are a huge number of differences in terms of local language, and that level of standardization is just, well, far from standard. And everything that kind of goes cross-border and then becomes a payment that goes through domestic rails, there really still are so many challenges in terms of how that gets translated and actually how you affect that last mile. Go ahead.
Yep. Yeah, so I think that sometimes we sit very much in, like EPA is an organization sitting between standards and innovation. And what we've seen in our market is so vastly, like so different. And I mean, it's an advantage to be different because that's what's been driving the innovation, but it's also challenges around when we're talking about interoperability. But you see the different players in the market. Over the years, things has come to this that we don't, what should I say? It's a growing recognition that we don't all have to be the same, but we have to be coordinated.
Makes perfect sense. And actually that ties quite nicely into my next question for you, which is around this interoperability aspect. When you spoke earlier, you said Asia is very much a digital first region. And you've also spoken to some of the country tie-ups as well. And so with the interoperability theme very much front and center, do you think that is influencing the approach to CBPR Plus in the region? And perhaps maybe let me add one more point to that. Is it being seen as a constraint associated with traditional banking infrastructure, or are you seeing some of these new entrants, newer paytechs, fintechs, PSPs wanting to come on board because of the broader goals in mind?
Yeah, no, definitely. I definitely think that people are seeing they need to have that a layer and understand and interconnect and interoperability with, because I mean, we had this discussion once, like, is banking bigger than payments, or is payments bigger than banking? And banking is still the trust in the systems. Like, most people would agree with that. And I think ISO hence has become an enabler for interoperability. And either you come from cloud or mainframe where you created your solutions, you see that you need to have that common language if you're going to be able to scale. And specifically, if we're looking at any paytech or fintechs that want to go global, it's a need. So I don't think it's more seen as an enabler, but also Joanne is addressing some interesting things about, okay, now we're coming to the customers. I think some of the fintechs might have had that eye already earlier on and already looking at what can we drive ROI here, and maybe even ROI for their bank partners. But one missing piece there is, like, how does it feed into those EDM and TRM systems so that actually the customer can both enter the data clear and clean to be able to power the system, but then also to draw that out. Can they say that, whatever we talk about SAP, or that can they actually digest those formats?
And actually, I want to come back on a point that you mentioned, which is very much linked to this as well, which is the standardization. And I'm interested in your view here. So, of course, there's lots of industry movements, G20 goals and various other, SWIFT and industry activities to look at how we truly get to a place of interoperability, harmonization, standardization. Now, sitting in a region like Asia, what's your view on that? Do you think standardization should accommodate local variations? Or do you think that globally we really should be pushing for stricter uniformity?
No, I think if you had a chance to see our submissions into the G20 projects, we're part of all the three task forces. We have a strong voice that global coherence matters, absolutely, but rigid uniformity doesn't always work, especially not for our region. And it might be a lot of different reasons, but one of those being, like, Latin language, Latin characters are not used everywhere. And also, if you want everybody on the bandwagon, like, who's going to decide? Like, you have, for example, reason codes. I think that is a topic that often comes up. Like, a lot of markets use different reason codes, and some markets aren't even making them available transparent. So how can we do? Yes, we need to have this common language, and we need to know and track and map how we map it, and preferable also the mapping back needs to be machine readable, so we can start to get that STP, even if it is local variances. I don't think we get everybody on the bandwagon if we can say it's one way. I think it's even some of the big banks that struggle with totally standardizations within one organization. You correct me if I'm wrong here.
I absolutely am not going to correct you, because you are not wrong. I think it's certainly a mammoth task, and something that all banks, us and our clients alike, are navigating. And Joe, because I have the benefit of seeing you here, even though our listeners can only hear you, I can see you smiling and nodding at times. So I guess I'm interested in your views as well on that, coming from the Europe side of the world.
It's a bit like dialects, isn't it? And we all speak the same language, but we all have a slightly different dialect. As you can tell from mine, I have a Scottish accent, which some people will understand and other people will have no way of understanding it. So for me, this is a bit about standardization and dialects. We all need to be able to speak the same language, but there are going to be slightly different flavors. I'm smiling as well, Camilla, at your point on special characters, because I don't know how many times I've seen incidents, particularly on SEPA, where it's special characters that kind of throw the payment out. So yes, there is something about we try harmonise around the different languages, special characters that are used around the world. Look, I think our intent should be to get to start standardization and harmonization, but it's not going to happen overnight because we are a complex world. And we all have our own local flavours. But if we truly want to realise the benefit of the investment that we have all put into this, the change that we are all going through, the change that all of our clients are going to go through, if we really want to move to the next era of digitisation, of data, of artificial intelligence, and really getting to a different place in payments and messaging, then we have to aspire to get to there. So
Yeah.
It'll take time though. We're going to be talking a different language. Like for those of us in banks, we've been talking about MT messages. Like probably nobody outside of banking has any idea what we're talking about. But we're all going to have to rewire ourselves and not talk about MT 103s and MT 202s and now to talk about the MX ones instead. There's a bit of unwinding we need to do and relearning. And we all need to get to the new norm, and that's going to take a bit of time.
It's a dictionary in itself, isn't it?
If I can add one thing on like global momentum or specifically regional momentum, we were quite active in this. So that was under the G20, the API expert panel. That wrote a paper came out late October about APIs, how to make APIs more secure and interoperable global. And it was looking a lot, it's all built around the semantics of ISO 20022, but it's like more about implementation. So coming to that, how can you actually make it easier to use the data coming between markets? And with that, is anything that is changed, like you have to map it and you need to make it available and you need to make it machine readable. So it's sort of a middle ground between that very strict standards and allowing for regional dialect or nuances into really looking at efficiency and implementation and use of this, because we all love the richer data and cleaner data, but like how can we actually make it come alive?
And Camilla, when you mentioned APIs, the other example I'm thinking of in Europe that we've had that we are maybe in a better place on now, but when it first rolled out, it was around the Payment Services Directive to an open banking and the new kind of API, being able to use APIs, and what was supposed to be a standard ended up having lots of different standards. So in reality, we had no harmonization when starting to use APIs for payments and information services. I think we've moved on from there. Interestingly, in Asia, they had APIs without regulation. It had to be regulated here in Europe to make it adopted. But even then, when it was mandated and adopted, it wasn't standard. So we have another example here in Europe where the regulation had good intent. Implementation was somewhat different.
Yeah, lots on harmonization and dialects. I love that analogy. It's very, very, it resonates very well. So I think sticking with the theme on harmonization then, and again, Joe, you mentioned earlier that maybe SEPA hasn't seen the full benefits that it could have seen at this stage, but perhaps now that the rest of the world is moving towards ISO 20022 under the CBPR plus mandate, we'll maybe see more. And you also mentioned that to do this well, banks are really, really going to have to start working together on figuring out how to navigate this. So with that in mind, I think we all know that the goal is to reach global harmonization. And we've spoken a lot about some of the challenges and the realities across different markets. And even in a harmonized region such as Europe, there still are very, very intricate details that make a difference. So how realistic do you think reaching global harmonization is, based on your very contrasting experiences to date? And maybe, Joe, I'll start with you, and then I'll see how Camilla reacts to that.
I think it depends what time frame we're talking about. Will it be in my era? Yes, I think it will be. But I think there's also other things going on around us that will, I don't know, maybe get to maybe leapfrog it. I'm not sure, but I think we will get close to it, but it's not going to happen overnight. And often you find the devil is in the detail, and we will find post-November that there are little nuances where things are not going straight through, and we see massive reductions in STP, and we need to just start working through all of the edge cases where we don't seem to have a common understanding and a standardization, harmonization. And that will take us experts around the industry to get together, to collaborate, to work through the detail and say, how do we get to the next stage on this? Because it's all within our interest to do so. So I think we will get there. But, if you look at SWIFT and the role that SWIFT plays, it's operating across over 200 countries, and it has, an element of standardization, harmonization, and has done for many, many years. This is about taking that to the next level. But if you throw in the mix something like how tokenization is starting out and DLT, that could be something that will run in parallel and end up overtaken anyway. So I think what global standardization, harmonization, interoperability might look like in the future could be very different to what we're talking about today. I also think there's one other point I want to bring out about Europe, and I know, Camilla, this will probably resonate for a number of the Asian markets as well, but for us to get to, I think, the vision that we all have, which is, bringing harmonization, bringing together cross-border payments into domestic payments, and actually being able to move money globally in the best way that our kind of end customers want to do it. You also need the local schemes to move to this standard and harmonization, and we're still quite a way away from that. So we still in the UK need to move faster payments to that. SEPA needs to open up, actually. So I know we've got SEPA one leg out on instant, but that has had, very little take up. And outside of the eurozone, I know lots of players want to be able to access the eurozone, but it's still a bit closed. So we need to be able to open up the domestic schemes. We need to make sure they're on the same standard for us to, I think, truly achieve the vision that many of us have around a global movement of money.
Thanks, Jo. No, I love those perspectives, and I think you bring in some really, really valuable points around all of the other things that are happening at exactly the same time as this. I guess we're all not sitting and waiting. We're all very actively engaged and participating in, but lots to be determined. Let's call it.
There's a lot of planets in the galaxy that are circling at the moment, and
indeed. Camilla, maybe I'll get your reactions and thoughts on the same question.
It's many thoughts come up there. You covered really well in the way I'm a believer that we will absolutely get there. And I think we see what technology is moving so fast now, both if we're looking at like LLMs or AI, or looking at what we're doing in DLT, blockchain, or tokenized money. But I think the biggest hurdle, and I know this is not the episode to talk about it, is definitely the regulatory harmonization that we need to crack. Because if we crack that also, we might be able to use those technologies in a more advanced way in cleaning up data and using data across borders. But those things we can't solve really quickly. I think we have to continue being at it and having shared intentions and purpose on where we're going. But maybe more so, like in everything we do, money talks, if we can start to see that return on investment and what we can create of the products, everything's going to move much faster. I think it really is always one that unlocks. When I think that's one thing why we haven't seen a lot of products coming to market on the back of PSD2, PSD3 or open banking in our region. It's just haven't been the monetization on the back of it. So just shifting the focus a little bit away from we have to do it, and I do understand you guys have to do it. It is a deadline, but starting to create those opportunities to see how can it actually add value.
Again, I think that's another really good point, and it's come up in a number of our episodes actually around this kind of compliance versus commercial aspects versus, actually at this point, and many of the comments Jo made, there's some practicalities of just getting this over the line, and there's many teething issues, and probably what I would refer to as hygiene at this point before we can start building, data models on top of this and or products that truly work in the way we intend for. But I fully agree. I think it's incredibly important that banks keep that return on investment in mind and start to think through the client lens sooner rather than later. And I also think that there's opportunity, certainly for global banks such as Standard Chartered, to really use our roles that we have within our industry bodies. We are a major cross-border volume player on SWIFT, and the level of advocacy that we can push for, and the benefit of our network and the number of banks that we work with really does start to become quite important as we will navigate this. So
Absolutely.
I've got maybe just a couple more questions. So the first question I'm going to ask it to both of you, but in reverse. So having listened to each other today, and it's been incredibly interesting, and thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. Firstly, Camilla, having listened to Joe on the Europe journey, do you think there's any lessons, maybe one lesson, that Asia might or could take from Europe as they continue on their journey?
I think in general, Europe has been more coordinated through the years for the whole region. We still have pockets that's left behind. I think a lot of the conversations happen in the big markets. So I think Europe has done a better work of that, even referring to the work that Joanne is involved in. So I think that is really, because it's just, we have to, all boats has to rise with the tide here, or it's going to stop somewhere when the money is being pushed across borders. So I think that one, and it's interesting to hear also that even in a more homogeneous market, that you have the same dialect challenges, and slightly, I know that we all believe that it will be standards, but you have there might be something we have to work around that to allow wiggle room for when that's needed. So I think it's a lot of similarities, but having more history to back it with.
If only we could go back in time and take all of the history into Asia, hey? And Joe, I guess the same question for you, having listened to Camilla today. Is there anything that you think Europe could take away from Asia's journey?
Yeah, I think this point on digital first, innovation first, and just having a slightly different mindset into how we solve a problem. It would be great for us to just be able to think differently and realize that doing something to get to an outcome that benefits the industry, benefits our clients, can come naturally, rather than having sat, being written into policy and into law for maybe 3 years before it comes, and then we all have this, oh, we've now got to go and do this, and it maybe not necessarily achieving the intent that we would have had if we'd actually just thought about it in a different way. So definitely that digital innovation, customer in mind first view that I think Asia often, they come up with things that are really quite transformational just because they're trying to solve a problem. So
fantastic. And then my final question to you both is, and it's a quick fire round, so short and sweet, but what is one myth about ISO 20022 that you would like to debunk? Joe, perhaps I'll start with you.
This is a compliance exercise. This is just about a regulatory program of work to get to a deadline to implement a new standard. And if we think that way, that's what it will be. And we will really lose the benefit that many of us have really can really see. But this is not about compliance. I think this is one stepping stone to something that, dare I say, being slightly geeky in the industry, it could be something quite magical for the industry, for the, end customer.
Great. And Camilla?
I was thinking that often can come out, the ISO 20022 is a costly bank migration. And I wanted to use Joanne's spin also that this is a bank opportunity, but for the whole ecosystem. We need to look upstream, and specifically, I would like to see the enterprise data management systems in the room to help us to get to value for all parties in the value system, including customers and clients.
Excellent final points. Thank you both. And with that brings us to the end of today's episode on ISO 20022 Made Simple. And I think we can fairly say that it's a global standard that's anything but a one size fits all at this point. The transition period will continue to be a critical change for us, and it will shape the global payments landscape for decades to come. And I think from today, we've learned that it is important to understand and align with the global vision, but the regional realities, whether that's dialects, special characters, regional harmonization requirements, schemes coming on the journey, native versus converters. We've touched on so many different realities. And I think in order to navigate this transformation successfully, all of those are really, really critical to keep in mind. So a very big thank you to Jo and Camilla for sharing their insights. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please make sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode with your network. And until next time, I'm Danielle, and this is ISO 20022 Made Simple, brought to you by Standard Chartered Bank.